The lace screamed before Denise did. Margaret Park didn't just remove the veil. She snagged it with a fist full of jewelry and rage, the metal
You are
comb
not
scraping
worthy
Denise's
of this
scalp so
family.
hard her head
Give her the
jerked
veil.
sideways.
Yes, put it
A
on
single
her.
drop
She
of
looks
blood smeared
beautiful.
against her ivory bodice. The cathedral went
You are
silent,
not
but Ethan
worthy
didn't
of this
move to help his
family.
bride.
Give her the veil.
He stood in his
Yes, put it
tailored
on her.
tuxedo,
She looks
laughing,
beautiful.
a sharp, arrogant sound that filled the hallowed space as he pointed at Denise's shame. A nanny doesn't belong in the park lineage, Margaret hissed, turning toward the front row to beckon Vanessa forward. Vanessa, striking in a bold red gown that mocked the sanctity of the altar, smiled as Margaret slid the diamond onto her finger. Denise stood bareheaded and bleeding, realizing the man she loved was merely a false king watching her ruin. Welcome to Korean Mafia Love Tales, your ultimate destination for gripping stories of the Korean Mafia, underworld power, and forbidden interracial romance. Dive into thrilling mafia tales filled with dangerous love, betrayal, obsession, and passion set in the dark and mysterious underworld. Our stories feature powerful Korean mafia bosses, strong female leads, and intense romantic connections that cross cultures and boundaries. If you love mafia romance, Korean drama vibes, billionaire love stories, and underworld tales, this channel is for you. Subscribe for weekly uploads of addictive mafia stories, Korean underworld romance, love tales, and dramatic storytelling that will keep you hooked till the end. If you want to see how this story goes, stay with me until the very end. And as we begin, hit that like button and comments. The silence in the park penthouse was heavier than the humiliation at the altar. Denise sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, her fingers tracing the jagged tear in her lace bodice where the fabric had surrendered to Margaret's fury. The ivory lace, once a symbol of her devotion, now felt like a cold, wet shroud against her skin. Shadows lengthened across the floor, stretching toward the door as the elevator chimed. Ethan walked in, his tuxedo jacket slung carelessly over his shoulder. He didn't look like a man whose wedding had just imploded. He looked like a man who had finally dropped a heavy, inconvenient weight. He didn't offer an apology or a hand to help her up. Instead, he walked to the bar and poured a glass of scotch, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, mocking cruelty. "You're still here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth that had fooled her for 3 years. He didn't even turn to look at her. "I thought you'd have the dignity to vanish quietly after that performance at the church." "Performance?" Denise's voice was a whisper, her throat raw from the tears she refused to let fall in front of him. "Your mother assaulted me, Ethan. She gave my ring to your mistress in front of God and everyone we know." Ethan finally turned, a sharp, arrogant smirk playing on his lips, the false king finally revealing his true face. "My mother did what was necessary for the park lineage. You were a nanny, Denise, a beautiful, capable distraction, but Vanessa is carrying the air. She's what this family actually needs." He set the glass down and checked his watch. "The cleaners are coming in the morning to scrub the nanny out of this place. Your things are already in those bags by the door." He gestured toward 3 black trash bags slumped against the marble foyer. Before Denise could speak, the elevator chimed again. Vanessa stepped out, her bold red dress a jarring wound against the neutral tones of the suite. She leaned into Ethan, her hand resting protectively over her small baby bump, her eyes gleaming with the triumph of the replacement queen. "The master bedroom is so much larger than I remembered," Vanessa purred, her gaze sliding over Denise's torn gown with a flicker of amused pity. "It's yours now," Ethan replied, kissing her forehead. He looked back at Denise, his eyes narrowing. "Get out, Denise, you've outlived your purpose. Don't make me call security to remove a trespasser from my home." Denise stood, her spine straightening with a sudden, icy clarity. She didn't look at the trash bags. She didn't look at the man she had loved. She walked toward the elevator, the ruins of her veil trailing behind her like a battle-worn flag. As the doors slid shut, the last thing she saw was Ethan laughing as he poured Vanessa a drink. The silence of the suite was over, replaced by the roar of an awakening power he couldn't possibly imagine. The humid night air of Atlanta felt like a physical weight as Denise stepped out of the elevator and into the lobby. She didn't stop to look at the 3 black trash bags the doorman had placed on a luggage cart. She simply kept walking, her ivory train sweeping across the cold marble. It wasn't until she reached the park bench 3 blocks away that the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp clarity. She remembered the way Ethan's mother had insisted on private dinners for the last 6 months, always centered on the Park family business and the intricate legalities of their upcoming merger. They had praised Denise for her discretion and her background as a nanny in Seoul, calling her the perfect, silent partner for a man of Ethan's stature. Now, the memory turned sour in her gut. It hadn't been praise, it had been a test. They were measuring how much she would endure before she spoke up, ensuring she was the perfect placeholder until their real prize was secured. A notification chimed on her phone, a social media alert. Vanessa had already posted a photo from inside the penthouse. The caption read, "Finally home where I belong. The wait was worth the legacy we're building." Beneath the text was a photo of the sonogram tucked into the frame of the mirror Denise had polished only yesterday. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The engagement hadn't been about love or even a mistake. It was a strategic sham. The Parks had used her presence to maintain an image of stability and tradition for their conservative investors, while Vanessa's pregnancy was high risk and hidden from the public eye. They needed a safe fiancé to parade at galas and board meetings, a woman with no family to protect her and no status to push back, until Vanessa was safely into her second trimester and the Park heir was official. Denise looked down at her hands. They were trembling, not with grief, but with a cold, terrifying fury. She had been their quiet nanny, the girl from Savannah who had worked her way through Korea and back, believing that if she served faithfully, she would be rewarded with a home. She had let them underestimate her because she wanted peace. But as she watched a sleek black sedan pull up to the curb, her expression shifted from the wronged queen to something far more dangerous. The Parks thought they had dismissed a servant. They had no idea they had just declared war on the only woman who knew where all their bodies were buried. The humid night air of Atlanta felt like a physical weight as Denise stepped out of the elevator and into the lobby. She didn't stop to look at the 3 black trash bags the doorman had placed on a luggage cart. She simply kept walking, her ivory train sweeping across the cold marble. It wasn't until she reached the park bench 3 blocks away that the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp clarity. She remembered the way Ethan's mother had insisted on private dinners for the last 6 months, always centered on the Park family business and the intricate legalities of their upcoming merger. They had praised Denise for her discretion and her background as a nanny in Seoul, calling her the perfect, silent partner for a man of Ethan's stature. Now, the memory turned sour in her gut. It hadn't been praise, it had been a test. They were measuring how much she would endure before she spoke up, ensuring she was the perfect placeholder until their real prize was secured. A notification chimed on her phone, a social media alert. Vanessa had already posted a photo from inside the penthouse. The caption read, "Finally home where I belong. The wait was worth the legacy we're building." Beneath the text was a photo of the sonogram tucked into the frame of the mirror Denise had polished only yesterday. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The engagement hadn't been about love or even a mistake. It was a strategic sham. The Parks had used her presence to maintain an image of stability and tradition for their conservative investors, while Vanessa's pregnancy was high risk and hidden from the public eye. They needed a safe fiancé to parade at galas and board meetings, a woman with no family to protect her and no status to push back, until Vanessa was safely into her second trimester and the Park heir was official. Denise looked down at her hands. They were trembling, not with grief, but with a cold, terrifying fury. She had been their quiet nanny, the girl from Savannah who had worked her way through Korea and back, believing that if she served faithfully, she would be rewarded with a home. She had let them underestimate her because she wanted peace. But as she watched a sleek black sedan pull up to the curb, her expression shifted from the wronged queen to something far more dangerous. The Parks thought they had dismissed a servant. They had no idea they had just declared war on the only woman who knew where all their business secrets were buried. The neon sign outside the Starlight Motel flickered, casting a rhythmic, sickly pink glow across the peeling wallpaper of Denise's room. She sat on the edge of a stained mattress, the ruined ivory lace of her wedding gown piled in the corner like the shed skin of a past life. The air smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap disinfectant, a far cry from the sandalwood and expensive lilies of the park penthouse. Her scalp still throbbed where Margaret's jewelry had clawed her skin, but the physical pain was secondary to the icy resolve settling in her marrow. She reached into the hidden lining of her vintage clutch and pulled out a burner phone she hadn't touched in 3 years. It was a sleek, encrypted device, a relic from a life the Parks assumed she was too simple to have ever known. They saw a nanny. They saw a girl from Savannah with no people to speak of. They never stopped to wonder how a woman with no resources had managed to survive the cutthroat underworld of Seoul's elite districts while working for the city's most dangerous men. Her fingers didn't tremble as she punched in a number memorized long ago. The call bridged thousands of miles of ocean, skipping through secure servers until it reached a private garden in South Korea. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. There was no greeting, only the heavy, expectant silence of a man who moved mountains with a whisper. "The debt is calling, Uncle," Denise said, her voice dropping into the low, melodic Korean she had perfected in the shadows of his estate. "Denise," the voice replied, deep and resonant, carrying a sudden, sharp edge of paternal warmth. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten the man who called you his chosen bride. I heard you were to be married today. A park boy, yes." "I was a placeholder, Uncle. A ghost used to haunt their halls until their real queen was ready. They humiliated me at the altar. They took the ring you gave me and put it on a mistress." There was a pause on the other end, a silence more terrifying than any scream. When he spoke again, the temperature of the conversation dropped to sub-zero. "They treated a dragon like a common sparrow. They do not realize that the soil their business grows in belongs to the Monroe Syndicate Trust." "I don't want a loud war," Denise said, her eyes fixed on the flickering neon outside. "I want the quiet power you taught me. I want them to realize that everything they own is held together by the nanny they discarded." "Then the activation begins tonight," the boss replied. "By dawn, the Parks will find that the world is no longer a welcoming place. Your throne has been waiting, Denise. It is time to come home to your power." Denise ended the call and let the burner phone drop onto the bed. For the first time since the Veil tour, she didn't feel like a victim. She looked at her reflection in the cracked vanity mirror. The glassy-eyed girl was gone, replaced by the awakening queen who held the Park's survival in the palm of her hand. The scent of sterile rain and high-grade antiseptic always brought her back to the winter in Seoul, when the world first learned not to underestimate Denise Carter. Long before she was the wronged queen at an Atlanta altar, she had been a nameless caregiver in a sprawling estate in Seongbukdong, hired to watch over the aging, iron-willed patriarch of the Han Syndicate. The Parks saw her nanny, years as a period of servitude. They never realized it was her apprenticeship in the art of survival. The turning point had come at 3:00 a.m. during a lunar storm. A betrayal within the Han inner circle had left the patriarch's bedside unguarded, save for Denise. When 3 men had slipped through the mahogany doors, blades glinting with lethal intent, they hadn't expected the soft-spoken woman in the nurse's scrubs to be an obstacle. But Denise, raised on the quiet resilience of Savannah and hardened by the isolation of a foreign land, had seen the shadow in the hallway before the floorboards even groaned. She hadn't screamed. Instead, she had used the very tools of her caregiving, a heavy oxygen canister and a surgical tray, to disarm the lead assassin with a precision that bordered on the divine. By the time the loyalist guards arrived, she was standing over the unconscious intruders, her heart-shaped face splattered with a thin line of blood, her expressive eyes wide, but cold with a new, terrifying clarity. She was still holding the patriarch's hand, her thumb resting on his pulse to ensure he remained calm. The boss hadn't looked at her as a servant after that night. He had looked at her as a miracle. "They see a sparrow," he had whispered in his raspy, powerful voice, "but I see a dragon waiting for her wings." In the years that followed, he didn't just pay her, he polished her. While the world thought she was changing bandages, she was sitting in the corner of smoke-filled boardrooms, learning how to read the quiet power of a man's silence and the tells of a liar's eyes. He taught her that true authority doesn't need to shout. It simply owns the ground the enemy stands on. Before she left Korea to find what she thought was a normal life with Ethan Park, the boss had bestowed upon her the title of chosen bride, not as a romantic prize, but as a declaration of her status as his protégé and heir to his secret American trusts. He had warned her then that the false kings of the West would try to break a woman who stood alone. Standing in that dingy motel room years later, Denise finally understood his lesson. She had never been a common sparrow. She was a queen who had merely forgotten the weight of her own crown. The following morning, the Atlanta skyline was obscured by a thick, oppressive fog, but Denise's vision had never been clearer. She walked into the private back room of a nondescript law firm in Buckhead, her spine straight and her chin lifted. She had traded the ruined lace of her wedding dress for a sharp, tailored black suit that fit her like armor. Waiting for her was Raymond Whitfield, the lead counsel for the Monroe Syndicate Trust, and a man who had served as the silent guardian of her father's legacy for over a decade. "It's time, Denise," Raymond said, sliding a thick leather portfolio across the mahogany table. "The Parks have been playing a very dangerous game with money they thought was anonymous." As Denise flipped through the documents, the false king's empire began to dissolve into ink and paper. She realized that Ethan and Margaret Park's prestigious dealership empire, the very foundation of their social standing, was a hollow shell. Every luxury showroom, every acre of prime real estate they boasted about at cocktail parties was funded by a series of high-interest mezzanine loans. Her eyes narrowed as she reached the signature pages. The primary creditor wasn't a bank. It was an offshore holding company that funneled directly back into the trust the Korean patriarch had established for her years ago. The Parks hadn't just humiliated her. They had done so while standing on land she technically owned and operating under debt. She held the power to call in at any moment. "They've been aggressive with their expansion," Raymond explained, his voice carrying the same quiet power Denise was now embracing. They missed a small clause in the latest restructuring. Because of the moral turpitude and reputational risk clauses in the contract, their recent public scandal at the cathedral gives us the right to audit their entire portfolio immediately. Denise closed the portfolio with a soft, final thud. The Parks had viewed her as a nobody, with no people and no resources. A broken bell they could discard once her placeholder role was finished. They didn't realize that by ripping her veil, they had triggered the very mechanism that would dismantle their lives. "They think they are the ones holding the cards," Denise said, her expressive eyes reflecting a cold, calculated justice. "Let them continue their celebration for a few more days. I want them to feel truly secure before the ground beneath their feet begins to give way." She wasn't seeking a loud, messy revenge. She was going to let the reality of their own greed act as the executioner. The nanny was gone. The auditor had arrived. The following week, the air in the Park executive offices grew thin, though no one could quite explain why. Denise watched from a distance, a shadow moving through the digital veins of their empire. With a single nod to Raymond Whitfield, the quiet power of the Monroe Syndicate Trust began to tighten like a silk garrote. She didn't launch a frontal assault. She simply began a routine review of the Park's commercial leases, a move that sent a silent tremor through the city's financial bedrock. Margaret Park was the first to feel the cold. It started at the entrance of the Botanical Gardens annual gala, an event she had chaired for a decade. When she arrived, expecting the usual deference, the velvet rope didn't move. The concierge, a man who had bowed to her for years, looked at his tablet with a clinical, detached expression. "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Park, but your membership appears to have been flagged for an internal audit. We've been instructed to freeze all associated invitations until the trust clears the paperwork." The humiliation was a slow, agonizing burn, far different from the sudden rip of a veil. Margaret stood in the foyer, her sharp cheekbones flushing a deep, angry red as the socialites she once ruled whispered behind their gloved hands. She was discovering that in their world, status wasn't a right, it was a lease, and Denise now held the pen. Meanwhile, Ethan's flagship dealership received a series of quiet, devastating visits from building inspectors and tax mappers. Each visit resulted in a minor complication that halted sales and froze his liquid assets. He spent his days in frantic phone calls, barking at banks that suddenly stopped returning his messages. He was the false king watching his borders shrink, and he had no idea the nanny he had evicted was the one signing the orders. Denise sat in her new office, a space of glass and steel that overlooked the very streets the Parks thought they owned. She watched the data points of their decline flicker on her screen, the missed club dues, the revoked credit lines, the cooling of their social climate. Every time Margaret found a door closed or Ethan found a bank account flagged, the debt of the altar was being repaid with interest. She wasn't just taking their money, she was stripping them of the only thing they valued, their name. The slow bleed had begun, and Denise intended to let it run until they were as hollow as the promises they had made. Peachtree Grand Ballroom was a cathedral of gold leaf and arrogance, smelling of expensive lilies and the desperate perfume of a social class clinging to its fatting relevance. Margaret Park stood at the center of the room, her spine rigid as she tried to ignore the cold stares of guests who had heard rumors of her family's sudden financial glitch. Ethan stood beside a glowing Vanessa, who preened in a gown of shimmering gold, her hand resting on the diamond that belonged to another woman. They believed this gala would be their reclamation, a way to signal to the world that the nanny had been erased. Then the heavy oak doors swung open, not with a bang, but with the quiet authority of a mountain moving. Denise didn't walk. She glided, her heart-shaped face framed by natural curls that flowed freely without the restraint of a veil. She was draped in midnight black silk that caught the light like oil on water, a sharp, regal contrast to the pale pastels of the room. Behind her, Raymond Whitfield and 4 stone-faced men in suits from the Monroe Syndicate moved in a formation that screamed power. The music faltered and died. The audience of judgment turned, their whispers replaced by a vacuum of shocked silence. Denise, Ethan's voice was a ragged edge, his smug smirk dissolving into a mask of confusion and rising fear. You shouldn't be here. Security. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. You have a lot of nerve showing your face after we threw you out like the help you are. This is a private event. Denise stopped 3 paces from them, her expressive eyes holding a terrifying, glassy clarity. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Actually, Margaret, it's only private if the owner says it is. She glanced around the opulent room, her gaze cool and detached. And as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, the Monroe Trust, my trust, has taken over the deed to this hotel and the management of this ballroom. She stepped closer to Vanessa, whose hand went instinctively to the stolen ring. You're standing on my floor, drinking my vintage and breathing air I technically pay the utility bill for, Denise whispered, her quiet power pinning them in place. The Parks aren't the hosts tonight. You're just guests who stayed far too long after the party ended. Denise looked at Ethan, the false king who now looked small against the backdrop of her shadow. She wasn't a victim seeking an apology. She was a sovereign reclaiming her territory. The audit is complete, she said, her voice carrying to the back of the room. And I've decided not to renew your lease on life. Air in the ballroom felt as though it had been vacuumed out, leaving the Parks gasping in the wake of Denise's revelation. Ethan's face, once the portrait of false king arrogance, turned a sickly shade of gray as he looked at Raymond Whitfield, whose presence confirmed the legal nightmare unfolding. The audience of judgment surged forward, not to support the Parks, but to witness their public execution. This is a mistake, Margaret hissed, though her voice lacked its usual power tyrant sting. You were a nanny, we checked your background. You have no people, no legacy. You checked the surface, Margaret, Denise replied, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the older woman's panic. You saw a girl from Savannah and assumed she was hollow. You never asked why a nanny was the only person allowed to sit in the boardrooms of Seongbukdong. You never realized that the Monroe Syndicate isn't just a name. It is my father's quiet shadow, and I am its sole heir. Denise stepped into the Park's personal space, her quiet power radiating off her black silk gown like a heat haze. The loans I've called in aren't just for your dealerships. They're for this lifestyle. The cars you drive, the clothes Vanessa is wearing, even the church pews your pastor stands behind, all of it is collateral for the Monroe Trust. Vanessa let out a small, strangled sound, her hand trembling as she clutched her stomach. but it was Margaret who truly broke. The realization that she had been insulting the owner of her own home for months finally shattered her composure. As the silent men from the syndicate stepped closer, Margaret's gaze fell to Denise's hand, empty and waiting. "The ring, Margaret," Denise whispered, her expressive eyes holding no malice, only a clinical, final justice. "It was never yours to give, and it certainly isn't hers to keep." With hands that shook so violently she nearly dropped it, Margaret reached out and snatched the diamond from Vanessa's finger. Vanessa didn't fight back. She looked at Ethan, but the betrayer was staring at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the woman he had discarded. Margaret pressed the ring into Denise's palm, her skin cold and damp against Denise's radiant brown warmth. Denise didn't put the ring on. She simply closed her fist over the cold metal, reclaiming her dignity not through a jewel, but through the truth. "The foreclosure is complete," Denise announced to the silent room. "Security will escort the Parks to the service entrance. Their belongings have already been moved to the sidewalk." She turned her back on them, the wronged queen, finally claiming her throne while the Parks were ushered out into the dark. The aftermath of the Monroe Syndicate's takeover was a quiet, clinical erasure. Within weeks, the Park name had vanished from the glittering marquees of the city's luxury dealerships, replaced by the understated, formidable branding of the Monroe Trust. Ethan and Margaret did not go out with a roar, but with a whimper, drifting into the gray obscurity of the suburbs they once looked down upon. Without the borrowed status of their empire, the socialites who once competed for their favor found they could no longer remember the Park's faces. Vanessa, ever the opportunist, had vanished into the night long before the final bankruptcy papers were served, taking her ambitions to a new city where no one knew of the Nanny, who had brought a dynasty to its knees. Denise stood on the glass-walled balcony of the Monroe Syndicate headquarters, the cool night air of Atlanta finally tasting like freedom. Below her, the city lights pulsed like the heartbeat of the empire she now commanded, a grid of gold and shadow that stretched far beyond the borders of Georgia, reaching back across the ocean to the gardens of Seoul. She was no longer dressed in the ivory of a victim or the midnight silk of a challenger. She wore a deep, charcoal suit, the fabric woven with the same understated strength she had learned at the patriarch's side. She opened her palm, letting the heirloom diamond catch the moonlight one last time. To the Parks, it had been a trophy of status. To her, it was a reminder of a period when she had allowed herself to be underestimated. With a soft, final movement, she set the ring inside a velvet box, not to wear it, but to archive it as a relic of the woman she used to be. The chosen bride wasn't a title she held for a man anymore. It was a title she held for her own destiny. She had been the wronged queen, the broken belle, and the lowly nanny. But as the wind ruffled her natural curls, she realized those were just names given to her by people who lacked her vision. A quiet chime on her encrypted phone signaled a message from Seoul. "The board awaits your direction." Denise looked out over the horizon, her expressive eyes holding the quiet power that now defined her. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need a veil to be sacred sigh. She was the architect of her own kingdom, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving the world, she was leading it. Under the vast, starlit sky, Denise Carter finally embraced the weight of her crown, knowing that while the Parks had fallen into the dark, her reign was only just beginning. Here comes the end of the story. If the story moved you, subscribe, like, and drop your comment.